Yeah, I was just curious if you read it.
Sure.
Thank you everyone for coming. It is my pleasure and it's my honor to introduce to you Professor Stephan Palmie, who's come from the University of Chicago, where he's currently the chair of anthropology. Professor Palmie has worked on an extensive number of issues. He's conducted research on Afro-Caribbean cultures with an emphasis on Afro-Caribbean religious formations and their relations to the history and cultures of the wider Atlantic world. His other interests include the practices of historical representation and knowledge production, systems of slavery, unfree labor, and many other things. One of the many books he's written, edited and co-written, this is the most recent of his books. It is The Cooking of History, How Not to Study Afro-Cuban Religion, which is a wonderful and extraordinary book. Today's talk, the title is Signal and Noise, Digging Up the Dead in Archaeology and Afro-Cuban Palo Monte. So without further ado, I introduce to you Professor Palmie.
All right.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Can you sign your name, please?
Okay, well, welcome all. Thanks for the generous introduction, Haida. Thanks for having me here. It's been a while since I've been here at the University of Wisconsin, and it's certainly nice to be back. Let me start out by giving a little bit of context for this paper. It's part of a larger project that I've begun before, actually begun quite a while ago. The beginnings go back to a piece I wrote in 2006, and I had hoped to get some headway on the matter, but then, as you just heard, the chairship of my department has befallen me, and so it's a bit on the back burner right now. Anyway, what this project concerns is, or let me give you the provisional title. It's Thinking with Ngangas, and you'll hear in a minute what Ngangas are all about. Thinking with Ngangas, what Afro-Cuban ritual can tell us about Western rational expert knowledge and vice versa. So what I've been doing over the past, maybe 8 to 10 years is write occasional pieces about how we can learn something about, Western forms of knowledge production through, by filtering them and their modus operandi through the lens of Afro-Cuban ritual. And this is part of my, this series of things that I've written, which, I hope to turn into a more cohesive argument. I've done work along such lines on, genomics, on transplant surgery, on analog media, especially acoustic media, on historicism, and in this case on archaeology. A new chapter that I want to write will concern machine recognition technologies. But anyway, let me just launch into the matter now, and you'll see hopefully what I'm after. I should also say that parts of it may scandalize the archaeologists. But hopefully it'll be a scandal that may be conducive to an interesting conversation. So, as Pedro Cosme Baños, the then director of the Museo Municipal Histórico de Regla, told me in 2003, Remigio Herrera, one of the most important founding figures of Afro-Cuban religion, to this day lies in an unmarked grave. Better known as Adicina, Herrera was the last African-born Babalao, or priest, of the Ifa oracle active in Cuba. Today, he is widely credited with having instituted the ritual mechanisms by which the cult of Ifa has been transmitted down to the present. According to the civil records in Cosme's possession, Adicina died in 1905 of senile debility at an unknown age and was interred in Regla's new cemetery that had opened only 5 years before. Now, in the aftermath of the 1991 reforms, the Cuban state has been careful to reevaluate its African religious heritage, as they call it, allowing, for example, the institutionalization of an association of Babalaos, Ifa priests, calling themselves Asociación Cultural Yoruba de Cuba, and assigning them a nicely renovated 19th century palatial building fronting the prominent Parque de la Fraternidad Panamericana as their official seat. It's very visible, in other words. In 1997, the state even granted the male esoteric sodality known as Abacuá, which it once actively persecuted, license to set up a plaque near Regla's historical embarcadero commemorating the foundation of Abacuá's first chapter there in 1836. Yet the museo, which after all is part and parcel of the state, has not seen fit to mark Adicina's grave, even though Cosme claims he and his colleagues know its exact location. The reason for this, I was told, was a preservationist one. Since adherents of another set of Afro-Cuban ritual traditions known collectively as the Reglas de Congo disinter remains of the dead to install them in power objects known as ngangas, Cosme told me that no sooner than Adicina's gravesite might become publicly acknowledged, his bones would be dug up and installed in one or more nganga objects. Didn't I know, Cosme asked me, that Andrés Petit, the 19th century founder of a particularly self-consciously syncretic Regla de Congo, Regla del Santo Cristo del Buen Viaje, also known as Kimbisa, that Petit had commanded his disciples to cut off his head after death and take it out of the country. The same, by the way, is said about the famous Babalao and Palero Eulogio Rodriguez, known as Tata Gaitan, whose corpse allegedly was decapitated by his junior members of his cult group and buried separately from his properly entombed body. By the way, Petit's head is said to have been smuggled out in a suitcase to Mexico. Now, if true, and this is just an aside, such gestures are by no means as bizarre as one might think. After all, none other than Pullman made sure his remains in Chicago's Graceland Cemetery were covered with a concrete slab massive enough to keep relatives of the strikers he had had Pinkerton detectives gun down from posthumously taking revenge on his remains. So, you know, I mean, not so exotic after all. But anyway, the irony in all of this, in Cosme's worries about preserving Adicina's corpse, the irony in this is that had Adicina died while still a slave, and he gained his freedom well before emancipation finally came to Cuba in 1886, had he gained his freedom before, had he died before he attained his freedom, none of these worries might have arisen for the staff of the Museo de Regla. Remigio Lucumi, that was the slave name recorded in his baptismal certificate, would simply have been interred in the old slave cemetery of Regla, which was bulldozed in the early years of the revolution to make place for the construction of a school, the architectural substance of which, as things go in Cuba, is now visibly crumbling. Of course, graves are dug up at Regla's new cemetery with fair regularity, and there's no question that grave diggers and sextons conduct a brisk trade in human remains. I mean, I myself, not in Regla, but in Guanabacoa, was offered bones for sale. And for that reason, Cosme and his colleagues are, perhaps understandably, wary of providing anyone with the logistics to dig up this particular grave so as to give the old African sage a new lease of life in someone's Nganga objects. Instead, they want to keep Adicina's remains undisturbed to preserve the relics of a culturally significant past for a future nation, one whose citizens might properly, that is, rationally, honor it as a scarce and non-renewable resource for the scholarly reconstruction and public consumption of Cuba's history, instead of harnessing Adicina's bones to mystical enterprises born out of irrational or otherwise inappropriate misconceptions about the dead and their role in the lives of the living. While not so much motivated by conventional archaeological concerns for site preservation, Cosme and his colleagues' reticence to make Adicina's grave publicly known speaks, or so I would argue, to a secular historicist ontology very much at the core of modern archaeological praxis. By the same token, however, it dramatically clashes with what I would like to call the anti-archaeology practiced by initiates of the Reglas de Congo. Now, let me momentarily postpone explaining what I mean by anti-archaeology and instead briefly sketch what I take to be some of the core tenets of archaeological historicism. As the great French medievalist Marc Bloch pointed out, any form of historical knowledge is knowledge from tracks. The material signs, and these are his words, perceptible to the senses, which some phenomenon inaccessible to the senses has left behind, end of quote. In Michael Oakeshott's terminology, efforts at reading such signs are contingent upon an organization of the phenomenology of the experienced world sub specie praeteritorium. Viewed in such a manner, symptoms of the past abound, awaiting diagnostic interpretation. We are surrounded by configurations of matter, whether monuments or middens, piles of paper on my desk, or the detritus of Afro-Cuban ritual that, once recognized as such, can be read as indices of past events and processes, including taphonomical ones. Still, a sign is only a sign if recognized as such. As Collingwood reminds us, and I quote, "Question and evidence in history are correlative." How exactly the surface of the contemporary world is to be carved up in regards to what Arthur Danto might call candidates for past-referring predicates is all but self-evident. Instead, this question points towards what, in semiotic terms, we might call a metapragmatic regimentation of indexicality characteristic of historicist, and this includes archaeological, practices of knowledge production. Now, since I cannot do justice to the epistemological issues involved here, let me be a little bold here and say that they revolve around what Latour might call a project of purification. We all ultimately live in a specious present, always imperceivably slipping into the past, while similarly sliding inexorably onward towards the future. We inhabit pluritemporal life worlds that brim with the material residues of what Gavin Lucas aptly calls unconstituted pasts, ready at hand as a Gestell, as Heidegger would say, for our contemporary pursuits, but unrecognized in their pastfulness. Yet, for both historians and archaeologists, objectifying the past by positing unbridgeable distances in linear chronological time is unavoidable. Anachronism is their boon and their bane, both in the sense of recognizing some extant object, a text, a coin, some unusual feature of the landscape, as stemming from a human past, and in the sense of the non-negotiability of successive temporal strata. No archive can be read in any other fashion. No material record unearthed except on the basis of assumptions that drive deep ontological wedges between carefully purified points on a chronological continuum. Once it comes to the willful or unintentional mixing up of times in the things that are taken to index them, we might say anachronism is historicism's, and so modernist archaeology's, Derridian supplement. Still, and perhaps unavoidably, this very program of purification, if you will, turns out hybrid after hybrid, as Latour, of course, would predict. Not only is it clear that the material record of the past is not simply found, but methodically discovered. It is also clear that it is made, laboriously carved out of surrounding matter, like an amplified signal that arises over and above what subsequently turns into ambient noise. The now opaque, rather than now significant, detritus of past life worlds. Yet contrary to prevailing scholarly consensus, indeed contrary to the rationale of most field sciences, like anthropology, it is not that the world is inherently noisy and so in need of methodically disciplined forms of pattern recognition. It is that we actively produce such noise by our disciplined searches for pattern. The hybrids of our own efforts at arranging the furniture of the world so as to maximize redundancy, in Claude Shannon's terms, and thereby make some mute stones speak, as the old canard has it, while silencing, in Rolf Trouillot's sense, other such deposits, whether in the archive or on the ground, in the ground. What shall we call the resulting artifacts other than the fetishes, or factishes, as Latour would call them, on which our world, as we know it, ultimately rests? But to say so, and leave it at that, is to do grave injustice to the fetish, the original hybrid object of Western epistemologies, as they came to foist themselves on certain constellations of matter and ideation, emerging in the cultural interstices created by nascent capitalistic practice on the western coast of Africa and in the context of the slave trade. And it would be likewise to frame matters this way would be likewise to do injustice to the Nganga objects, distant cognates of 16th century Congolese fetisos that are at the center of Cosme and his colleagues' worries about Adechina's remains. For it isn't simply that one man's indigenous osteoarchaeology is another man's looting or vandalism. What fashioning a Nganga object involves is to blur actively and methodically a multiplicity of bright lines by which contemporary Western ontologies and epistemologies, I should say, divide subjects and objects, agents and patients, matter and spirit, people and things, life and death, past and present. Now here's what a practitioner of Palo Monte or any other Regla de Congo might do should Adechina's gravesite become known to him or her. Having taken both mundane and spiritual precautions, bribing the sexton, mystically fortifying oneself, a palero would sneak into the cemetery under the cover of darkness, seek out a previously identified grave, and proceed to ritually interrogate the dead by oracular means. Proceeding from the assumption that the dead retain aspects of human personhood, such as volition, communicative abilities, characteristics and capacities displayed during life, and so on, and that they are also, or that they remain pegged to their skeletal remains. On this assumption, the Palero will begin to outline the details of a trata, or pact, to the Nfumbi, which is the term for dead, in question. The goal is to find a muerto who wants to get out of the grave and make him or her a deal that he or she cannot refuse, as a Palero put it to me once. But of course, the contract proposed is of a non-revocable nature. If the muerto or Nfumbi consents, the Palero will give him or her a new form of embodiment in a Nganga object in exchange for services, trabajos, rendered and remunerated by periodical sacrifices of blood and other substances that will maintain the Nganga's force and vitality and bind the Nfumbi in a cycle of reciprocal exchange with the Palero. Now, once consent is secured, the Palero will extract skeletal remains from the grave. Ideally, if you would go for the cranium called Kiyumba, then he will carry them to his or her, or he or she will carry them to his or her munanso, which is a domestic sanctum. And with the help of ritual assistants, he or she will proceed to methodically build up, the term is montar, what in effect constitutes a new life form, the Nganga, that constitutes at once a complex and transtemporally dynamic, that is growing in a literal sense, assemblage of heterogeneous matter, and a named, personified, and willful being capable of effecting change in the world and of engaging humans in what at times are quite dramatic interactions. Generally housed in metal cauldrons, calderos, often wrapped tightly in iron chains, Ngangas, or prendas as they are also called, have an appearance that is visually arresting. Indeed, it's striking across a whole variety of sensory modalities. Branches, palos, hence the name Palo Monte, branches of dozens of different types of wood appear to have been forcefully jammed into the compacted substances that compose the cauldron's contents. Wax, blood, soil from a variety of social locations, such as a cemetery, a hospital, a market, a police station, and so on and so forth. Water from a river and from the sea, aguardiente, cooking wine, metal implements like knives, coins, keys, razor blades, padlocks, herbs, the remains of various animals, seashells, small amount of quicksilver, gold, other minerals, and so forth. All of that crowned by the kiyumba, the cranium of the dead, and surrounded by offerings of food and tobacco, and covered in the blood of repeated animal sacrifices. That's how you have to picture a Nganga object in its natural habitat, so to speak. Ngangas reek and rustle. Once one gets close enough for their putrid odor to overwhelm one's olfactory sensorium, insects that have been feeding on their contents will startle and scurry about in erratic ways. It's quite an experience seeing something like that for the first time. At least from the perspective of seeing and smelling, at least from the perspective of Euro-American commodity aesthetics and hygienic norms, Ngangas present the aspect of pollution raised to the status of a method. Yet while they seem to bristle with matter out of place in Mary Douglas's sense, Ngangas possess internal coherence, and their fulminant materiality obeys a logic of its own. One that combines metonymic elements that embody the Nfumbi and metaphorically organized materials that express and direct the nature of its powers. These components act in synergetic concordance, so that while, for example, the human remains will guarantee the inspired nature of Nganga, willfulness, personality, agentive force, certain characteristics of the person which should be known, whose skull this was. In addition to that, the human remains guaranteeing the inspired nature of the object, the addition of, for example, a dog's head, the skeleton of a bat, a desiccated scorpion or spider, all of these will channel such force by amplifying and directing the ways in which the Nfumbi or Muerto will conduct its mystical errands, such as, for example, smelling out its target in the case of the dog's skull, flying in the night, like the bat, or stinging and sucking the life out of the victims of sorcerous attacks and counterattacks. Of course, like all people engaged in such things, all paleros will many of them, unless they're in a boastful mood, all they will tell you is that they return sorcerous counterattacks. They never attack themselves. All they do is heal. But in as far as these disparate materials that go into the making of Nganga objects are concerned, I mean, they're always on the lookout. So they, for example, walk along railroad tracks to see if, sort of some.
The answer is no. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was just curious if you read it.
Sure.
Thank you everyone for coming. It is my pleasure and it's my honor to introduce to you Professor Stephan Palmie, who's come from the University of Chicago, where he's currently the chair of anthropology. Professor Palmie has worked on an extensive number of issues. He's conducted research on Afro-Caribbean cultures with an emphasis on Afro-Caribbean religious formations and
project that I've begun before, actually begun quite a while ago. The beginnings go back to a piece I wrote in 2006, and I had hoped to get some headway on the matter, but then as you just heard, the chairship of my department has befallen me, and so it's a bit on the back burner right now. Anyway, what this project concerns is, or let me give you the provisional title. It's Thinking with Ngangas, and you'll hear in a minute what
relations to the history and cultures of the wider Atlantic world. His other interests include the practices of historical representation and knowledge production, systems of slavery, unfree labor, and many other things. One of the many books he's written, edited and co-written, this is the most recent of his books. It is The Cooking of History, How Not to Study Afro-Cuban Religion, which is a wonderful and extraordinary book. Today's talk, the title is Signal and Noise, Digging Up the Dead in Archaeology and Afro-Cuban Palo Monte. So without further ado, I introduce to you Professor Palmie.
All right.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Sign your name, please.
Okay, well, welcome all. Thanks for the generous introduction, Haida. Thanks for having me here. It's been a while since I've been here at the University of Wisconsin, and it's certainly nice to be back. Let me start out by giving a little bit of context for this paper. It's part of a larger project.